All right, this video is a reply to Professor Anton's video, which was a reply to a video by iMoniker. I just want to say one thing, and then I want to read a passage from a work by the phenomenologist and metaphysician Max Scheler. Possibilities are often said to be realized, so to say that possibilities are real is going against the grain of the sort of intuitive sense given to us through the common usage of language in the sense of modal logic or the sense of modes of being. Uh, so I don't know. I mean, possibilities is to me, anything that is not contradictory is possible. And then we talk about potential, things that are potential, uh, or events that are potential states of affairs. And then then you have what's real and what's necessary, and all these things are bound up in this tradition of thinking about modes of being in these terms. And I think that a really good or an interesting solution to this problem was presented by Deleuze following Bergson and and more modern developments in biology and dynamical systems and topology uh, and other disciplines, and where he radicalized it and made it philosophical. And he says that Deleuze says something like, I'm paraphrasing, he says something like that reality is not opposed to possibility. Rather, it's it's um, it's not possibilities which are realized, because we want to say that there are these potentials or um, these potential differences from what's actual, and that they're real too. So he says that he makes the distinction between actualization and or actuality and virtuality, and they're both real. And it's really an interesting discussion that's really made clear. And he sort of gets rid of the postmodern jargon. It's done by Manuel De Landa. He's got some videos on YouTube, and it's called the book is called Intensive Science and Virtual Philosophy. Sorry, that's kind of terrible, but anyhow, that's an interesting video in it, or series of videos in itself. But what I want to read now is I think something that's really relevant uh, to what Professor Anton has been trying to describe or explain um, about nothingness and these sorts of concepts. Uh, and he says that Max Scheler writes in an essay called Idealism and Realism. He says that in this particular essay, he's interested in understanding what foundational relation there is between the reality of something, or of objects, and spatiality and temporality. So Scheler says spatiality does not yet mean space. Every space has a certain form, for example, three-dimensionality, uniformity or non-uniformity, etc. Spatiality, in contrast, is that which makes every space, whatever its form, into a space. By spatiality, we understand only the fact that there is a simultaneous apartness in general. By apartness, which also belongs to temporality as well, we mean that an identical nature does not collapse into one thing so long as a number of instances of it can be given. Spatiality as well as space, in turn, are sharply distinguished from extension. So he gives a really interesting and clear exposition there. And then he continues, he talks about how the body creates space, and is sort of the basis for spatiality. And what that includes and what that precludes. And then he says that basically spatiality is the power or the tendency toward the actualization of movements, not the movements that have just been done or the movements that are being done currently. But I'll just read it. He says, spatiality, viewed from its subjective side, is at first nothing more than the experience power of being able to perform living movements. Consequently, it is not our view that the already performed movement gives us the central experience of spatiality, any more than the actual movement being performed right at the moment. Rather, the experience of the power of spontaneous self-movement, just to the extent that it is not put in play, but remains in potentia, furnishes the most original datum of spatiality. We cannot represent to ourselves any sort of spatiality in which the peculiar phenomenon of the void does not appear, the phenomenon of that intuitive meon or non-being, that lack which proceeds from the factual datum itself. So remember, he's not talking about space, he's talking about spatiality, which is this power to be able to perform movements. And he says that we cannot understand any sort of this future power to perform movements without the phenomenon, a peculiar phenomenon of the void appearing. This phenomenon of the void is, in any event, pre-logical and certainly has nothing to do with the function of negative judgment. The phenomenon of the void is of the greatest interest. It arises, in the last analysis, from the experience that occurs when a driving hunger for spontaneous movement has not been satisfied or fulfilled. This hunger, in the end, conditions all perceptions, as well as representations and the spontaneous images of fantasy, which are independent of external perceptions. Thus, the phenomenon of the void, which is bound up with the power of self-movement, insofar as self-movement is connected with this unsatisfied hunger, and must be given as a stable background, or the phenomenon of the void, which is bound up with the power of self-movement, must be given as a stable background prior to all changing perceptions and even the material images of fantasy. The emptiness of the heart, says the emptiness of the heart is remarkably the principal datum for all concepts of emptiness, including empty time and empty space. The emptiness of the heart is quite seriously the source from which all emptiness springs. The empty path, the stationary empty path, so to speak, which our drives take as they reach out in every direction, is constantly at hand. So too is the background of perceptions which is connected with this empty path. And it is only man's urgent impulse to move, varying in force and direction, which produces that rare marvel, the unheard of fiction of man's natural worldview, that a particular kind of non-being seems to him to precede every positively determined being as its foundation, empty space. In the natural worldview, space appears as a stationary, unlimited void, truly prior to and independent of all things and movements. It appears as a substantial void. But this form seems to remain in existence, even if one imagines all things and their properties to be arbitrarily changed or even completely abolished. It seems to remain even if one discovers or assumes totally different laws of motion than those that in fact obtain. The natural worldview shows us things in space, that is, things which are represented in space like goldfish in their tank. It contains the strange paradox that it shows us the only positive being of existent things as a mere filling in of an antecedent underlying space, absolute, empty, and stationary, as if things were present only to stuff out this void at particular spots and to move themselves in it for a time like goldfish in a bowl. Okay, I've got about one more minute. I'm going to skip around. He has a kind of a critique of Locke and John Locke and Democritus, which is interesting. And the last thing he says that I thought was pretty powerful would be he's talking about ecstasis, which is a Heideggerian term, or well, originally Greek. Anyway, it says he talks about it does not seem to me too bold a hypothesis that this surplus of the empty over the full, this priority of a stationary empty space over all spatial content, has its roots in the primary property of human nature. Well, we'll keep going. He says life spatializes itself. Which time? Got 30 seconds. Wanted to read this thing. Okay. Well, I'll have to finish. He says that even God would have to deal with spatiality, and spatiality which arises through resistance. So even God himself would have to. So he's not going to equate nothingness with any sort of understanding of God. Anyway, thanks.